Hey everybody, welcome to Drive-Thru Review 452. Today we're going to talk about deception, murder in Hong Kong. Now you might have seen this before as CS Files. I believe it came out at Essen as CS Files. This is being brought over by Gray Fox Games. Got a rename and I think a retheme. I'm not too familiar with the original, but what this basically is a kind of social deduction game mixed with Clue. So it has elements of Clue and Mysterium and Codenames and Concept and The Resistance and like every kind of social game that you can think of. We'll spoil the review a little bit. It actually works pretty well. So one player is going to be kind of like the Ghost in Mysterium. If you've played that, they're going to play the forensic investigator. And they're going to have these boards out where they're marking different words and giving hints, but they can't speak. And then some of the other players are trying to figure out what they're saying. And then one or maybe more of the players are a murderer and an accomplice. And they have a different cards and they're trying to sort of throw everybody off the game, you know, try to point all the accusations at Billy or whoever and try to evade all the guesses. And then so whoever, if you guess the murderer, then all the investigators win. If the murderer doesn't get guessed, or maybe finds out who the witness is, or so on. So let me talk about the mechanics and how it all works, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think of it. So as I said, there's been a murder in Hong Kong, and it's the job of the forensic investigator as well as the other investigators to figure out who the culprit is. So here we can see the components that you get in the game. The first thing you're going to do, and this is going to be dependent on the number of players, you're going to shuffle up these different role cards here. Now you're always going to have a murderer, you're always going to have some investigators, and you're always going to have a forensic scientist. And sometimes you might have an accomplice and a witness. And so like I said, the job of the forensic scientist is to give clues and without speaking try to give different clues, and you're going to get these cards here which I'll show you, and it's going to be like, here's the location of the crime, and then you could give that, and here's the cause of death, and then you also have a bunch of random ones, and also some of these will have special abilities and things on like that. So let's set up a little bit and I'll explain how the mechanics work. So let's pretend for a minute that from our viewpoint here, we are the forensic scientists. We've dealt these cards out to the other players. We were dealt the forensic scientist card here. And we're going to know who the murderer is because everybody's going to close their eyes. And then we're going to say, okay, murderer, open your eyes. And they're going to point to two cards that are in front of them. All the other players are going to have some of these two types of cards that are in front of them. You can see here I've got two of these giant stacks, and these are called the clue cards. And then these are like the means cards. So these are sort of like the weapon of choice maybe. So we've got a lab sample, anthrax, a ladder, candlestick. You'll have guns and radiation and all kinds of cool stuff in here. So this is sort of like your murder weapon. And then you're going to have all these sort of incidental, sort of free association types of clues. So everybody's going to have 4 of each type of card in front of them. So just for argument's sake, I just put 2 of each card instead of 4 of each card just to kind of give you an example. So what's going to happen again, everybody's going to close their eyes. I'm going to say, murderer, open your eyes. And they're going to point to one card of their clues and then one of their means cards. So maybe they point to dentures and chemicals. That kind of makes a little bit of sense. Maybe they poison their dentures, and then, you know, that's how they killed the victim. Now, if there was an accomplice present, and you'll shuffle this into the deck if there's more players, they would also open their eyes. They don't necessarily point to anything, but they're going to see who the murderer points to or what items they point to, and then I'm going to know who the accomplice is. But they're going to act as a way of kind of throwing off the investigators as they try to guess what the murderer picked. So what the investigators are trying to do is make a guess and say, these are the 2 cards you picked. Even if they are pretty sure that this player is the murderer, they don't get to win the game unless they pick out the exact 2 cards, because then of course they have the proof, quote unquote, to figure out who the murderer is. Now each investigator is going to get 1 of these badge tokens, and these are going to be spent, and that's going to be kind of like their guess for the game. So they're going to kind of hold on to those towards the end and then make their attempt to solve the crime by discarding the badge. Now if there is a witness involved, then what's going to happen is after the murderer and or the accomplice do their shenanigans, everybody's going to close their eyes, and then the witness is then going to be able to open their eyes, and then the forensic investigator is going to point to the murderer and the accomplice if they're in the game. They're not going to know anything about the cards that are picked. They're not going to know if there's an accomplice, who the murderer and who the accomplice was. They're just going to kind of know generally which cards we have to look at, but they have to be careful and not reveal themselves. If at any point in the game the investigators do solve the crime and point to, you know, the matching items, then the murderer has an opportunity to name the witness. If the murderer names the witness and says, Billy, you were the witness, because the witness was so obvious that they kind of knew who was who, then the murderer will still kind of have a last second victory by pointing that out. So once all of that has been established, then we now, as the forensic scientist, are going to start to give clues. Now remember, we can't speak or give away or cheat or any way. And the first thing we're going to do is we have this one cause of death tile here. So this gives you a few causes of death. We've got suffocation, severe injury, loss of blood, illness, poisoning, and accident. So we'll put that out. We'll choose one of these location tiles. There's 4 location tiles. We'll find one that kind of matches. So let's take a look here. I've already got an idea. Okay, we'll do this one here. Let's see. Yep, okay, this one. And then we'll randomly pull from this stack of tiles. We'll have 4 of these, and then as the course of the game goes, we'll add more and more of these. And these are just different sort of random things, kind of like free association things. So if you've played Mysterium, then, you know, it's kind of like doing the same thing but with words. So instead of just suggesting hints and giving sort of free association with pictures, you're just doing this with words here. So you draw some of these, and then you also have these special ones as well, which go some distance to helping the investigators. And then what's going to happen is the forensic investigator has these little bullets here, and they're going to mark these down, and sort of like the game of Concept, again, you're trying to do this free association. So in this case, we're always going to mark this one. And of course, I'm going to mark poisoning on that. That's probably a dead giveaway. Although you could have mercury and surgery might come into play. So, you know, nobody knows anything. We all know what's happening because, you know, we've got the camera here. But chemicals, so that's not bad, but it is poisoning. And then I would mark the location here probably as bathroom, maybe bedroom, because some people do keep their dentures in the bedroom. But I would kind of go with bathroom there. And then here I just grabbed this one, innocent bystander. I don't know, you might mark smell because the chemicals, I think that would be a better bet. I thought of maybe doing nothing down here, which is at the bottom, because there's nothing with a bystander. It probably wasn't a bystander if you poisoned their dentures, because they'd probably be alone. But we'll go ahead and go with smell, because that maybe is association with the chemicals. And then as the player starts to put these items down, players can start to discuss slowly as they put stuff out, and you can react to what the players are doing. Now normally there's going to be 3 more of these out here. Like I said, you draw 4, but just for camera frame's sake, I've kept it out of there. And then what's going to happen after you've covered up all of these is you're going to be able to draw another one and then replace one of your existing, because sometimes you're going to get these and it's going to be not have anything to do with what you've got in front of you. For example, this one here, the victim's build: large, thin, tall, short, disfigured, fit. You know, maybe not really super indicative of what the clue actually is. So this might be something that you actually replace. And then, like I said, you also have these special ones. So once you start to replace tiles in the 2nd and 3rd rounds, you'll have these shuffled in. You won't ever start with one of these. These are always going to possibly trigger after the fact. After you go into the 2nd and 3rd round, and these are going to be ways to kind of help the investigators. And then so after you have done your 3rd round, after you've replaced your 2nd tile, then you have some time then everybody has to make a guess at that point if they haven't already. And the rules say to kind of give everybody a chance around the table to go through and make a presentation, but I found that it just kind of usually devolves into a free-form discussion anyway, which is fine. But if you wanted to be real strict about it, you could do that. The only other rules to mention is, let's say somebody guessed chemicals and wig for some reason, because that, you know, that could possibly be one answer. As the forensic scientist, you don't say, oh, you got one of them right. You just say yes or no. If they guessed, you know, everything, then you say yes, or if you got partial or totally incorrect, you just say no, and that's all you can really say. But that's pretty much how you play the game. Okay, so that is Deception Murder in Hong Kong. What I think of the game: I love this game. It's awesome. So if you watch my channel at all, you know I'm a fan of different social deduction games, not all of them, but a lot of them. And like I said at the beginning, this is kind of like a Frankenstein of them, but it doesn't feel like a Frankenstein. To me, this one really excels at presenting the theme. It works so well because, so from a thematic perspective, let's talk about that. That's really my favorite part of the game. As the forensic scientist, you are basically the evidence. You're not even really a person. You're almost like evidence in the abstract, because you can't speak, you can't say anything, you can't give any hints, and you're just saying, okay, here, this was, took place in a bedroom, and it was stinky or it wasn't stinky. It was a violent death. It was poisoning. It was a blunt trauma. Those kinds of things, and those are just like the clues, literally the clues that the investigators use to figure out the crime. You are the clues, and that's kind of how I think of it. Or, you are the forensic person who's saying, hey, we got this back from the lab. This is what we saw. I really have no idea what the murderer is, but here's the clues. You, the investigators, you discuss it. And then you have the elements of the accomplice and the witness, and that is probably the best way to play the game with those extra roles, I think, because you just have that much extra dynamics at the table. Now, there's one issue, and I kind of alluded to this in the walkthroughs, and for me it's not an issue whatsoever, but I have played this with a few different groups, and I've seen it where, like I said, it can kind of devolve into a free-for-all, and the rules really suggest not to do that. I don't have a problem with it. The problem that you can get is if the murderer and the accomplice just keep us the heck out of the discussion and just overwhelm everybody like that. And so you do need sometimes to pause and say, you know what, Billy, what do you have to say? 30 seconds, you get to say what you're going to say. But on the other hand, it's like, well, I don't want to be able to not interact with Billy at all and ask him a question like, oh, and clarify what you were thinking and what you're saying, or try to suss him out and call him out for being the accomplice. Like, I don't want to prevent that activity. So I think that's just going to vary group to group. But for me, it's not a problem. I'll play it either way, because I think it's kind of nice to shine a spotlight on somebody. And especially if they're the witness, for example, then they have to be very careful about being too revealing and throwing, clues one way or the other, because then, like I said, the murderer can call them out at the end if they get called out. But yeah, it's a great game. It's really fun. I would say it's probably, from my experience, I've played this 6 times now, and it seems a little bit easier on the murderer, but there are different variants, if you find that to be the case, that you can do. So I showed you 2 different cards in front of each player for the 2 types. You can do like 3, it says. I mean, 2 would be way too easy, but you could go from 4 down to 3. You could go from 4 up to 5 if you find it's easy for the investigators and maybe playing with kids and stuff. Like that. And then you've got the extra tiles that you can shuffle in with the different events, after the second and third parts of the game, and those all help the investigator. And then you can also, one thing we found was that when I made the association here of the dentures and the chemicals, that was like a legit thing. Now, you can be a murderer and be very crafty about what you pick, because if there's a lot of cards out, and we saw this in one example, was somebody had a hook, I think, and then there was a heel and there was another pointed object. So they chose their pointed object and then something else that was kind of like all the other cards out there. So it was basically impossible to figure out, because you could make legit arguments for the different things, because the investigator was saying, oh yeah, blunt trauma or whatever the clue was at the time, piercing, and you're like, well, there's 5 different things that will pierce out there. So as the murderer, you can game it a little bit. And so we actually tried it where, okay, you have to do something that kind of makes sense at least, and maybe you could even put them on a time limit. You got like 20 seconds to pick your cards, or 10 seconds, and then you go for it like that. Maybe deal all the cards first, and then you deal the rolls after that, or something like that, so that they don't have time. Or maybe if you can play with that. That's what I'm just trying to say, because that can be an issue if you get a murder, and that's kind of not in the spirit of the game. I think if you're really trying to like game this game, then well, no, maybe go play the Gallerist or something. You know what I mean? So anyway, but I really have enjoyed this game. It's been a blast to play, and it's got, like I said, it's got that Frankenstein sort of feel when you sort of look at it on paper. It's like, what? This is code names, it's concept, it's clue, it's the resistance, it's mysterium. It has all of those elements into it, but then you look at the game and you're like, this is like a murder mystery, and I'm actually solving it. And it's really, really fun that way. So definitely take a look at this as it comes out. So thanks.